Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody in the background that made this event happen. Is it okay if we just jump right in without a lot of preamble? Okay. When I first looked at this, I was thinking I'd move from simple to complex. Then I realized that simple isn't simple, it's complex. So that's where this is coming from. So I'd like to start with a book. You know, you go to a bookstore, you get a book, and I don't think you realize, just like you don't realize right here, all of the things that go on behind the scenes. And so you start with a publisher, and there are probably 20 people behind the scenes there working on editing, applying for grants, just keeping the whole operation running. A lot of them are volunteers. A book design, like Kiss Cut Designs, Natalie does magic with books. I just can't explain what she does. I can only explain it as magic. She gets it, and whatever she puts on the cover says what the book is about. Kathy does the publicity in town, and again, she does magic. She knows all the people who can sort of get the message out about the book. You have independent bookstores and other bookstores like Pages, where they support local writers. And again, local writers don't necessarily exist unless they have a place to sort of get their books out. Then those bookstores are the places where readers tend to gather and the word gets out, and it's sort of an organic process. I can't really explain how it works because a lot of it's word of mouth or people to people. And then finally, you have organizations like Lambda Literary, and they support the LGBT community. They were out of the States. And I think there must be thousands of people who volunteer to keep that organization running. So when I look at this whole thing of just a book on a shelf, I don't look at it as a book anymore. It's more like a tree with all those branches and leaves, but then it's the climate that supports it. It's the water, it's the soil, it's all of those things. Okay. Am I making any sense yet?
Yes.
Okay. And I always have trouble finding the answers because there's so much BS out there. Like, we're inundated with it, and especially now at this particular time. I think it's the age of BS, and I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. But I think to find answers, sometimes fiction can be a way to get there. And the way I find sort of the answers is not in front, like where I'm standing now. It's back there, say, where Jessica is. You really get to see what's going on. So it's the back of the bus, it's the back of the room, the back of the coffee shop, and back alleys are great places where you can sort of walk and see what's really going on. And lots of times for a writer, you can get some great images from back alleys as well. So the other thing I try to look for is ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And so, like my next door neighbor, he was in Poland before the war. When I was growing up, of course, and he was taken prisoner by the Russians. And then when Hitler invaded Russia, all of the Polish, all these prisoners who've been in Siberia ended up in Palestine to become cadets in the Polish brand of the army. And then he ended up in Canada. So he never told me this story until I started writing, but I lived right next door to it. And I was also fortunate to meet Dave Sweet, who's a homicide detective in Calgary. So we have urban hunters. I don't know if you have ever run into one of those, that particular kind of personality, but he says that his job, when they start an investigation, all truths will be revealed. And he has that kind of personality. It's totally upfront, totally honest about himself, very direct. I also, in university, was really lucky to meet or be in the class of Marin Chorney. And one of the things that sticks with me from university is that bullshit baffles brains. Because we were at the time, there was so much going on about how we wouldn't have jobs. And so I asked him about that, and he said what he learned was in the Air Force. So he was a navigator on Lancaster bombers during the Second World War. He knew the statistics. I think the casualty rate was nearly 50%. So statistically, he didn't have long to live. And he asked one of the guys who'd survived, how do you react to all this? And the guy just said, I know where my parachute is. I know where the escape hatch is. And that's all I need to know. And so I think in this age, just to cut through all of the chaff, I guess. And one of the ways I find that it's possible to cut through all that chaff is to actually go to the places that people talk about. So I guess we'll start at the top with Cancun. So at this one place we stayed, there's this beautiful architecture, and it kind of set the mood for the place. And after we'd been there a few days, I didn't realize that at night, the sea turtles would come up out of the water and lay their eggs. So there's this whole other thing going on there that I didn't even know was going on. And I got up late one night and sat on the beach and watched this happen. So you have one thing going on, and then there's this whole other thing that's happening that you're not aware of. This summer we went to Yorkton, Saskatchewan for a wedding, and I'd been working on this character. Her name is Lauren. I couldn't get a handle on her background, and I just started walking around Yorkton, and it just started to happen. I can't explain how it happens, but I saw the tracks going out of town, and I saw this barbecue machine out behind a building, and I started to realize where she came from and why she had to leave, because there's a conversation that happened around that barbecue, that happened in my head, that started to give me that personality, that character that I'm going to need. I don't know if you've been to Lake Koocanusa in southeastern BC. That's this one here. But on the east side of the lake, there's a highway, a 2-lane highway that goes up to Jaffrey. But if you stop in the fall, anytime there's a culvert that goes under the road or a bridge, that's where the kokanee spawn. So the water on the surface is just water, but underneath there's a gold there. And it's this amazing thing that's happening if you're lucky enough to be there at the right time. And again, kokanee became an idea, became inspiration for something else. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to Chichen Itza, or do you want to go to Cuba? Where do you want to go next? Chichen Itza, okay. Every time they sort of expand their excavation of Chichen Itza, they find more about this culture that was there. There's just some amazing things. If you ever get a chance, just go there in the wintertime because it's too hot in the summer. But if you look at this, you know about the serpent and the solstice, you know about that. There's a spot there where you clap your hands in it, and the echo makes the sound of a local bird. There's a place where they're excavating now underneath one of the ruins, and they find that it's built on ruins. So again, there's so much going on there that you can just sort of inhale as you listen, as you stand there. I don't know if you've been to Cabo San Lucas. It's one of my favorite places because the whales winter there. And so there's this whole world going on under the surface, and you get glimpses of it, and it's fantastic. But you only get glimpses. It's like staying up at night watching meteors. You got to just be watching. You got to pay attention. It's amazing stuff. And I guess we'll end up in Cuba. So before we went to Cuba, we'd heard so much about this place and what it was like, and there was all these opinions, and mostly from people who hadn't been there. And so when I actually talked to a guy from Cuba, he said, people are funny when they go to Cuba. Some people get upset because there's no peanut butter. and you know, they're not prepared for the fact that it might be a little bit different from home. And there are people that go there and kind of accept that. So I really saw this on a tour bus as we went to Havana. There were people complaining because it was a socialist country. These are Canadians, okay, so we can't go with stereotypes here. And there was one lady who was really upset because you had to pay a peso to pee. So the way I saw it was people trying to make a living, eh? And so you had to sort of adapt to the culture. And one of the things that I really noticed about the place was that you would have the images that you've been prepared for, the old cars, the beautiful architecture, the narrow streets. One thing that's missing is the intensity of sound, because the streets are narrow and everything's magnified. And then there was the resort we stayed on, which was built on old machine gun emplacements because they were worried about invasion. So there's all of this undercurrent there. So if you ever get a chance, go. Don't listen to me. Just find out for yourself. So what we're really talking here about is the how of how we get to sort of understanding things as opposed to the why. So I think it's kind of trying to learn to read the signs. So if you look at this picture here, I don't know if you can see it, but there's kind of a zipper in the sand. That's what's the mark that sea turtles make when they make their way up the beach. So in the morning, if you ever see that on a beach, you know what you're looking at. They dig holes, and I call it a zipper in the sand from their 4 flippers. And then how you get these kinds of eyes, I'm not sure. I call it new eyes, fresh eyes. I came from a culture when I was 17 where a lot of people, and this is kind of my joke about the time, but people were worried about the price of butter. So in a developed country, you know, we freak out about crazy things. And then in high school, I went from going to St. Mary's, cloistered Catholic school. No girls were in the school. It was a boys' school. Every once in a while, a girl would show up, and we sort of didn't know what we were. And so I went from that to a school in Singapore, and the kids asked me, you know, have you ever been to Boogie Street? And Boogie Street at that time was a street that they'd just close off, put tables in and chairs, and you could have a beer, you could have something to eat. And about midnight, these beautiful women would swim through. Women who used to be men, who are now women, and they were beautiful. And so this whole thing of, if you can imagine, coming from a boys' school to this kind of environment, it sort of turned my world around, and the whole thing about gender and what I'd been taught, it started me questioning everything. And for me, it was a good thing to question all of those things. And those fresh eyes, I have to sort of warn you about them. If you do get fresh eyes, if you start to see things as they are, you see some beautiful things and you see some ugly things. So you have to be kind of ready for that, because not all knowledge is beauty. Some of the beauty is this picture in the middle is my grandchildren standing on a dock. It's a place called Fork Lake. It's up towards Lac La Biche, out in the bush. And when I took that picture, it sort of stuck with me because my kids had been on that dock and sort of the same kind of pose. And now when I look at that picture, I don't just see the picture. I see, you know, if you ever go to Lululemon and they have those mirrors that are facing each other, and reflections go off into the past and into the future, and I sort of see DNA stretching into the past and into the future, and sort of feel in the center of that. It's kind of, that's what those new eyes can do for you, but just be prepared. Sometimes it's, you see things as they are, and it can be a little bit frightening. And I found that I'm starting to look more and more and to enjoy paradoxes. So this beautiful mural on the left here is in Cuba, and right next to it is another part of Havana. So there's the beauty, and then there's this, I think that toilet must have been 100 years old because it sure smelled like it. So if you can imagine the humidity, the stink, and it sort of, to me, those two images sort of summed up Cuba from my perspective, and the crap that they'd gone through to sort of build their own little society. And the other thing that I started to realize, and this is about following your instinct and how you feel and how your body and how your mind and how your heart all react to certain things, is I learned from going to sweat lodges. I was just privileged to be able to go to sweat lodges. And it's sort of a spiritual experience, but the whole taking judgment out of the experience. So most of the times I'd been close to a spiritual experience in a church had been overlaid with judgment and guilt. But this environment was free of that. And also the whole idea that when I'd ask a question, the response would be, well, what do you think? So the answer wasn't important. It was the journey to the question. And I'd like to finish with sort of this is a sad, happy story, so we're taking that paradox and we're smacking it together. So tragedy, and lots of times I deal with tragedy with humor. So in 1940, my grandmother died. My mother was 8. And when my mother died, she'd made it pretty clear, she had a way of doing that, that she wanted her ashes buried with her mother. So in the fall of 2012, we put the ashes, dug a hole, and it's way up in the boonies, because they'd been living on at that time they'd been on a homestead. And my brother went up to visit her the next spring, and somebody dug it up. And so we were, when that happens, you go through a whole bunch of emotions, you can imagine. Anger's one of them. Grief, you go through the grief all over again. So we couldn't, I still don't know who did that, and I'd still like to honor her wishes, but what we could do was put up a marker to say, this is her spot. And also I was writing at the time, and I was starting to write comedy. And through the comedy, I could invent this character, this hapless character, and it happens to his mother, the same thing. Her ashes get dug up. But then I can catch the people who did it. And then I can say, what do you do after tragedy? How do you survive that? So I invented a place called Corporation Alberta. Their claim to fame is that they make the world's best sausage. They have a statue to the sausage. Okay, see where this is going? So see the bananas? You got it, okay? And then just by chance, I was watching a video, and in Kawasaki, Japan, they have a festival to the penis. And I thought this whole town, out of a tragedy that happens at the town, is going to have this festival. And then it had a life of its own, and it was a way of sort of dealing with tragedy and finding an answer to this question I'll probably never find an answer to, but I'm always going to be looking for and always going to be watching the signs. It's like, if you've ever been whitewater rafting, you know how they teach you to watch the river and you can see what's under the surface just by the way the water reacts? So I'm watching the water. So there's the big picture. And thanks again for having me. I'm sort of done. Did you have any questions that you wanted to ask?
You mentioned earlier about urban hunters.
Yeah.
That's a phrase I haven't heard before. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more about that type of person? Or?
So I was a high school teacher. Because of what happened in the States, they started going through this process of what do you do if somebody comes in with a gun? And the policeman was talking to us, and he said, just lock your doors, don't let anybody in, and we'll be in the hallways hunting. And that just stuck with me, the whole idea of that we do have people who hunt in the city. And they look out for us. So, and especially for the most vulnerable, because most of the murders that take place in the city are people who are vulnerable. So that's where that comes from. Okay. My hands are cold, sorry.
Do you do that process when you're not traveling, and do you kind of maintain that urban hunting sort of approach as you're just living your daily life as well? How do you do that?
I have a dog. I know this is a weird answer to your question, okay? But my dog takes me around the neighborhood. He does his own thing, and while it allows you to get to know the neighborhood and things about the neighborhood that you wouldn't have necessarily known. So I find walking is essential in my case. And there's certain parts of the city I like to go to and just get to know them and get to know the people there. And then the stories come from that. Does that answer your question? Like, I love this story, but I grew up in a time when there was so much prejudice towards gender in the community. And one of my favorite places in the city is Diva Dave's. Where, do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the awesomest places because it shows that the city has kind of grown up and grown away from some of those old, angry, misinformed statements about people. So it's those little places, there's little islands of it here.
Well, maybe that falls into this question. So your novels that you write, the Detective Lane series, they're all based in Calgary here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious why, to be able to write about anything you want, that you've chosen this as your home base for the novels.
I guess this sounds glib. It's not intended, but why not? You know, why not write about Calgary? Because I find this to be a fascinating place. I've grown up here and I've been away from it, and I came back with these different eyes, and I find it fascinating, the people that live here that come from all over the place and their lives. And I think I also have a bit of a chip on my shoulder about that, about, you know, the joke about Calgary, what's the difference between Calgary and yogurt? Yogurt has a living culture. So I wanted to show that Calgary does have a culture, and I think the floods proved that point. You know, it was remarkable the way people just showed up. You didn't even know their names, and they would show up. Then they'd move on to the next house. And I think that culture is pretty powerful. And I see that in a lot of places, and a lot of kindnesses that have been sent my way from people from all over. There's a beauty in that, I think, and I like to get to that. Yes, ma'am.
I don't know if this is a question or a statement, I definitely find that we're exposed so much to American culture and other culture, and even in Canadian culture, a lot of it's Toronto and Vancouver, and it's really important to hear stories about this place that we inhabit and tell our stories.
Yeah.
There are some local writers where it never feels like there's enough Calgary stories happening out there.
Yeah. I think there's only a couple of people who have kind of caught on to that. I think Zosky was one. I think Rick Mercer is another. He travels the country and gathers stories and tells them. And I love that. It's not just based in one place. It's based all over. There's something else going on that happens outside of the major areas. And yeah, I think you're right. To ignore all of those other things that are going on is kind of missing the point. We're good?
Yeah, I was going to say, so where could we get your books?
Pages. Now I'm drawing a blank. There's another independent bookstore downtown, Shelf Life, and there's one on Elbow Drive, and I just drew a blank. I don't. Owl's Nest. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Everyone. Thank you. I need that. But there's also sometimes the major booksellers sell the books. Sometimes the UFC carries them, or they're online. But thank you.
Great.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.